Hi, my name is Gemma Jennison, and I will be delivering today's webinar on domestic abuse in rural communities. I work as part of East Riding Voluntary Action Services, more formally known as Community Vision. And as there, I have two main roles as both the Domestic Abuse Lead Representative Support Officer and also the Safeguarding Development Officer. My details will be available towards the end of the session, so please get in touch if there's anything further I can assist you with. So hello and welcome to today's session, Domestic Abuse in Rural Communities. We're going to be looking at the role of communities in tackling domestic abuse. As mentioned, my name is Gemma Jennison and I work as part of the Community Vision team on both the safeguarding and domestic abuse contracts. Just a little bit of housekeeping for you. This is a pre-recorded session. So it has been recorded in advance of the actual session in order for those that are unable to attend to watch this session separately. And it will be added as part of our YouTube and socials. Throughout the session, I will be using both the terms victim and survivor, as I feel that both are equally important. Whereas some people feel more connected with the term victim because they feel like it encapsulates the impact and the trauma of what they've experienced, others much prefer the term survivor as they feel like it fully captures their journey and their ability to escape from the abuse. Do ensure that you look after yourself as part of this session. We will be discussing some topics that some may find difficult. If you do need any sort of support or assistance, I will be giving the domestic abuse East Riding details at the end of us, but also please come forward to me if you are part of another local area and you would like us for me to connect you with some form of support. So here are the aims of today's training session. We will be looking at what domestic abuse is, and we will also looking at how it affects those in rural communities. In addition to this, we'll be looking at what additional barriers are faced by victims of domestic abuse in rural communities and some of the ways in which they may find it more difficult to escape that violence and abuse. In order to do this, we'll be looking at some of the key findings of the research undertaken by the Rural Crime Network. It's a specific document and piece of research that will be shared with you, and the link to this will also be shared as part of the session for those who want to go away and look at the research more in depth. Finally, towards the end, we're going to look at the role of communities in tackling domestic abuse and how it's important in collaborative and partnership working across the sectors and with all partners. First of all, I would welcome you to pause this recording and just write down on a small piece of paper what the term domestic abuse means to you. I would like you to think about kind of legal definitions, forms of abuse, and the ways in which it's impacted on those that do experience it. So there's lots of things that come to mind when we're looking at domestic abuse, and it is really quite hard to try and encapsulate that into a small sentence or paragraph. However, we do more formally, with the introduction of the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, have a formal definition that will look at how we understand domestic abuse. So essentially, it represents when the behaviour of one person, generally the perpetrator, towards another person, being the survivor, is domestic abuse if both victim and perpetrator are aged 16 and over, and that they are personally connected in some way or form. Personally connected simply refers to the fact that there is some formal connection, whether that is a relationship, a marriage, whether they're connected by family, but that is that personal connection in terms of the law. The behaviour is abusive if the behaviour between both parties consists of any of the following: physical or sexual abuse, violent or threatening behaviour, controlling or coercive behaviour, which represents behaviour that is is not always physical, but with an aims of intimidating or coercively controlling somebody into behaving a certain way. It may also be considered abusive and domestic abuse if it is a form of economic abuse. That is more formally or more widely known as some form of financial abuse. And lastly, if the abuse is psychological, emotional, or any other form of abuse. The key thing with domestic abuse is that it does not matter if the behaviour is one single incident or a whole course of conduct. Even one incident of any of the behaviours previously looked at on the previous slide may be considered and investigated as domestic abuse by police if it does come under those conditions as outlined. And again, there's a little further explanation there on what economic abuse, and it's any behaviour that has a substantial adverse effect on a survivor's ability to acquire or maintain money or property or obtain goods or services. So even if the behaviour is not directly towards them and it may have an impact on something else within their life, if it does have an impact on their ability to maintain or acquire money, goods or services, it still could be considered to be economic abuse. I think it's also key to mention here, as mentioned at the bottom, that the behaviour can be still considered domestic abuse when it is maybe aimed at a survivor, but it actually might be physically made towards another. For example, this is more often seen when perpetrators choose to use children as a means at getting at a victim or survivor. I invite you now to take a look at the diagram, and this is it's a diagram taken from the research done by the Rural Crime Network. Now, the darker areas of the map are supposed to outline areas where there is more concentrated, or basically where there is domestic abuse. Now, as you can see, the whiter areas are much lighter in colour, and the lighter areas are supposed to represent areas where there isn't domestic abuse. However, what we know is that there is domestic abuse in those areas. So what we're going to look at today is why the diagram might not be as accurate as it can be seen there. Yes, some of the darker areas may represent where it's more condensed, but there is vast areas there represented by lighter areas on the diagram where we're not picking up and we're not seeing these same numbers. So based on that, I would again invite you just to pause the recording to just spend a few minutes thinking about what additional barriers to seeking support for domestic abuse those in rural areas may face. So think about things that may affect their access to gaining support. Think about the ways that they may have impact in not only accessing it, but actually speaking with others as well about their experiences to get that. After you've made a note of a few of them, after pausing the recording, please press play again and we'll continue with the session. Here's a few list of just a few. This could go on a lot, but it goes over some of the key barriers to seeking support for those living in rural communities. Obviously, at the top is public transport. Things are much more spaced out. Public transport is less frequent. Public transport is maybe not as easy to access, and the nearest public bus stop or train station may be some way away. So in terms of those trying to seek support for domestic abuse, it's much more difficult to access those routes of both seeking support and escaping abuse. There's an increased isolation. Again, linking in with the access and the isolation, you've got that probably a lot more increased isolation from others, neighbours, friends, family, services, those who may be able to provide support or at least give advice around support. You've got internet, broadband and phone line difficulties, again, all restricting a victim or survivor's access to both emergency services, other support services such as housing, benefits, welfare, legal, etc., particularly if access via a phone or the internet is cut off within a property. Generally, people in more rural communities tend to have smaller local networks. We will look at these networks as part of further in the session, because these networks, although they can be really supportive, can also be unknowingly quite collusive. There's less presence of health and emergency services, and quite often those in rural communities have to travel further in order to access the support, whether it be health or not. In terms of those in abusive relationship and where their access to others is purposefully restricted, obviously that becomes so much more harder. Again, in rural communities, what you tend to see is more isolated homes and detached rural properties. It's quite common to have maybe 1, 2, 3, or a small number of properties in one area that may be surrounded by vast areas of landscape with very little homes, shops, and things like that, which all provide them sort of links with the outside world, which are so valuable to a victim of abuse. Again, you've got access to phone lines and phone boxes. You've got families living more locally can become unintentionally more collusive. Again, we will look at this as part of the the presentation. And attitudes to seeking support may be very different. So what we see more common in rural areas, and we will look at as part of the research done by the Rural Crime Network, is that the communities can be a little bit more collusive in terms of having those more patriarchal views and behaviour systems. And again, we'll look at that as part of the results from the research. So the research itself was done by the Rural National Crime Network, which was established in July 2014 and is supported by 30 police and crime commissioners and police forces across England and Wales. The aim was to encourage a greater understanding and recognition of the problems and impact of crime in rural communities. So this was crime on a larger scale, but very much included that of domestic abuse because of its prevalence in stats and figures around crime and serious violence. It was something that they needed to address and look at. Its mission is to give rural communities a voice and to encourage the reporting of crime in these areas. And I thought a really key kind of quotation that I picked out from there by the chair of the National Rural Crime Network, Julia Mulligan, was that too often rural communities can fall second fiddle to urban demands. There's a lot of assumptions that we can make because there may be figures that are lower in terms of populations, in terms of services and things. And what they can find is where there's not as many public pound to person spend, that obviously they can become less investment and funding in those areas. And an aim of this was to highlight just the difficulties that these areas are having and the problems in which they're facing in order to put these kind of on a public agenda so that they get more recognition and they're addressed a little bit more. So we're going to look at the findings from the research. There was 10 key findings, and I think each one of them is equally just as important in terms of us understanding why it is that these areas are demonstrating lower numbers in terms of reporting of domestic abuse, but also they really help to create this picture of why it is that domestic abuse victims are both experiencing just the same figures, but also that we're not recognising as much and how much more difficult it is for them to leave those domestic abuse relationships. So one of their findings was that the abuse lasts on average 25% longer in most rural areas. And again, there's a few things that kind of contributed to this, such as the issues around exiting the relationship and how much harder and more complex there is. When somebody is trying to leave it, we've already looked at all the difficulties in terms of accessing that and support, those choices, those options, and therefore all the things that are put in place in terms of if somebody does make a decision to leave the relationship, how much harder it is to therefore do it. So you've got there about victims in rural areas experiencing significant additional barriers, so much more difficult to just walk up to a service or to telephone a service if you have got telephone, landline, internet issues, public transport, so if you don't have access to a car. So victims there experience more upheaval it seems to be apparent from some of the research that it's just so much more difficult in order for them to make them changes, access that support, and stay away and remain away from the relationship. Services are harder to access, and that also makes it more difficult for services to engage with the person, which again we'll look at further as part of the webinar. Victims are half as likely to report their abuse. And again, I think that's kind of the above points really kind of illustrate just why they may think twice a little bit more about whether to make that telephone call or try and seek that support. Another finding from the research was around the policing response. So the policing response in rural areas may not be as good as that in an inner city area. It's, you know, it's more accepted now that a lot more police stations, if you was to go back some years ago, they were more situated within communities, they were open more. We do more online now, we're less in person. And a lot of these services, unfortunately, the buildings have been either closed down or they're no longer used. So for victims, it's probably, and particularly those in rural communities, it's not as easy as maybe just walking up the road or the street or getting on a bus and making your way to a local police station to seek some support or help. They also acknowledged that there was a lack of female police officers in more rural areas. Now, particularly with female victims of abuse who may have a real fear of either a male officer, or there may be additional barriers around how the reporting of that behaviour may be interpreted by a police officer that is male. You know, having that female police officer and that female police presence may just make somebody, particularly when you've got elements of sexual abuse, may make that victim a little bit more open to having that discussion and seeking support. And also you've got the obvious element, which is victims live much further away from police presence. So just the police presence within a community can have an impact on how safe and unsafe someone feels. And if you were aware that your nearest police station is 7, 8, 10 miles away and you had no car to get there, you know, you're very well aware that you're quite some distance from a local police station. A further finding was that the more rural the setting, the higher the risk of harm. As we know, victims living in rural communities are around 25% that will remain in the relationship, 25% longer than victims in more urban areas. So they're already more, like a quarter amount of the time, more likely to remain in that relationship. Now, the report does acknowledge that the patterns of the abuse and the escalation of the abuse tend to be very similar between more rural and urban areas. However, what we know, because victims are more likely to remain in the relationship for longer, is that it's quite inevitable that they will suffer more harm emotionally and physically. And the more rural the setting, the harder it is to get support. And sometimes the less effective the support can be, simply because of the difficulties in meeting with, in communicating safely with, in providing options, in seeking whatever specific details it is that that victim needs support with. It's just, on the whole, so much more difficult. And obviously, the more rural that is, if you've got one property in the middle of a vast area, it is understandable that trying to communicate with a victim in that property is probably that higher. People are going to see you coming and going from that property more. And again, we'll look at that in terms of the community a little further on. You know, accessing that victim is harder. Trying to ensure that access is not seen by the perpetrator is harder. So on the whole, it is just a lot more difficult. Another really important one is that rurality and isolation are deliberately used as weapons by perpetrators. You know, what we see, not just from this research, but in research generally around domestic abuse, is that perpetrators will move victims purposefully to more rural settings and properties to further isolate them and to use the isolation to their advantage. They're very well aware that the more they can keep a victim away from the outside world, outside influences, alternate views and options and things like that, the more that they are likely to remain in that relationship. The more rural the victim, the greater the impact of the isolation. Again, it links in with the previous slide around if it is extremely difficult for us to get in and support a victim in a property, the chances are that they're also going to find it equally just as difficult to leave. Again, another key finding was that isolation not only facilitates the control, but it also makes it increasingly difficult for victims to leave. And physical isolation is arguably one of the best weapons an abuser has. If there's no contact, no access, no transport, all of these things that provide an opportunity for a victim to try and seek support and flee a situation, if those are limited and really restricted, it's also obviously very difficult for them to leave. A further finding from the research is that close-knit rural communities can facilitate the abuse. The report acknowledges that strong community spirit is one of the joys of rural life. And, we all understand this kind of idealistic view of moving away to the country and being part of a community, a small-knit community, and everybody knows each other. And there's lots of positives with living in that kind of lifestyle. But also, it can also be equally powerful in keeping domestic abuse hidden. And again, it's not always knowingly or willingly. So in a small community, and it links in with the following point, if somebody did try to seek support, if they did ask a police officer to come over, if they did ask a social worker, an IDVA, which is an independent domestic violence advocate, just for those who've not heard the term before, who is specifically, it's the job role to support victims of abuse. If somebody is accessing that property, if somebody's visiting that property and they're trying to do it unbeknown to the perpetrator, other people will notice the presence of a police car or a new car that's visited, or somebody that doesn't normally visit it, and may ask questions and may report it, and unintentionally, they may find it that they're actually putting a victim more at risk because of the fact they've had a discussion around somebody else visiting that property. And again, abusers often recruit the community to their cause. Now, quite often, and in my experience as a qualified and independent domestic violence advocate, what I have seen is that perpetrators will collusively use their family as part of the abuse and the process. So, for example, they may consider relatives that the victim is not very well or has mental health issues, they can't look after themselves, they're going crazy, they're whatever the terminology may be. And what they may feel is then that they will ask the family members, can you come in and check on them? Can you take them to the shops? Can you make sure that you take them there? Can you take them to the appointment where they can't be there? And what they will use it as use their family and friends as another way of monitoring the victim. So not only does the victim start to feel that they cannot escape because somebody else is watching them and sensing what they're doing, and it just really builds up that fear and that intimidation that victims feel. Unfortunately, the other parties, in some cases, they are very collusive. And I have known where victims of abuse are purposefully monitored and really closely controlled by a perpetrator, relatives. It could be their parent, it could be a sibling of theirs, very much. And they've even got children on board to collusively work to monitor and really closely control a victim. And some, they're very unintentionally, unwillingly thinking they're doing something, and they're kind of just going along with it because they don't want any trouble from the abuser or the perpetrator, not really knowing that they are very much controlling that victim also and preventing them from accessing any support or choice or options around leaving. Another finding in terms of the research was around traditional patriarchal communities and how they control and subjugate victims. So interviews that were done with victims and survivors living in the rural communities, demonstrated that these areas are still very much dominated by men, and follow quite a set of old age protected and unwritten principles. They discussed situations around how there's very much that hierarchy of system of male and women and that power imbalance between the sexes within the communities. And some of the kind of examples they give there is that the men tend to hold positions of power within the rural communities. So it tended to be quite male dominated. They tended to be the heads of households. There tends to be landowners, landlords, policemen, farmer. So they tend to hold lots of responsibility, but also lots of power. So therefore had more choices. They had more resources. So it was very difficult outside of that for women to assert themselves and hold them levels of power, because quite often they would be passed down to other generations of men within the family. And what really came out of that in terms of the discussions in the research around these patriarchal communities is that quite often they leave women more vulnerable to coercive controlling behaviour and prevent women from speaking out and accessing support, because they're very restricted in the power and the choice and the resources and the finances that they have as women living within those families and communities. Another finding from the research, we kind of touched upon it earlier, is that support services are scarce, less available, less visible, and also less effective. Victims reported from rural communities that services are much harder to find and engage with. You know, we've already discussed that they are less available, less easily accessed. They're less known, people not necessarily discussing them. You know, in a community where your general day-to-day life is controlled by maybe what's going on at home or in the local community, particularly if you're a local policewoman on that side, or maybe a farmer, or something that tends to work on the land and within a community, and very much didn't require you to leave that community other than maybe some basic essentials. Life tended to revolve around what was going on in that community. Therefore, discussions about domestic abuse services, maybe social care services, things like that, there were much less of a prevalence and harder. And for some, you know, won't even know that a domestic abuse service even exists. And what equally they found is that services, although they can be accessed, they're harder to access. They may also have less of an understanding about the additional barriers that are faced by victims of domestic abuse in rural communities, and they're less aware of the significantly more complex needs around starting that new life. So even, you know, before they can consider fleeing a situation, you know, it's about understanding the barriers that are even preventing them from having that first discussion. So it's just so much more harder to engage with them. And it's equally just as easy to kind of pull away from a support, or equally as a service to pull away from a victim when it feels like you're not getting anywhere because of the barriers that you're facing. So a further finding is that retreating rural resources and seeking help and escaping harder. You know, we are all very much aware of funding, resource restrictions on a national, right across the country, in terms of various things that as a country we've seen that have affected public spending and public services. So, and we can see services retreating and generally in decline. So they are limiting the support networks and escape routes. And, you know, we'll see those kind of public spends and limitations that are affecting, you know, not just services, but it says there like buses, trains, emergency services, broadband, everything at some point has been affected, and we've been required to kind of pull back and tighten the belt a little bit. But equally, they have all had an impact on how much more difficult it is for victims in rural communities to seek support. And again, they're that less public pound spent per person, because these rural areas may have a population much smaller than maybe a really condensed urban area. Naturally, less money is being spent in that area, but actually some of the figures that are coming out of them rural areas are not an accurate reflection because of how difficult it is for those victims to report. So it's a kind of like a bit of a vicious circle, which again we'll look at in a minute, and the things we can do to try and help that. A further finding is that short-term hand-to-mouth funding models have created competing and fragmented service provision. Absolutely links in a little bit with the last slide. You know, we've got this lack of understanding about domestic abuse, the scale of it, just how it's impacting people, why it's maybe not showing up as prevalent in some areas and not, and that kind of how all of this has resulted in that fragmented landscape of service provision across the country. And another finding is an endemic data bias against rural communities and how this leads to gaps in resources and support. You know, as we know, rural victims are half as likely to report their abuse. Then we also know that they're 25% more likely to stay within that relationship. But it also means that much less is known about the abuse, what good interventions are, and how effectively we can prevent rural domestic abuse. We know that it's going on, but we know that also they're not coming forward and reporting it, in which case that's having an impact on services and provision in that area, and then ultimately what we understand about it and how we do work with those communities. So for me, it's just of the utmost importance that we are aware it is occurring, and actually we need to get these numbers demonstrated. We need to know that they are there, because they very much are there. They're just not showing up in the statistics. So implications of fewer services to support rural communities, you know, we do work a bit on a supply and demand, and there needs to be that demonstration that there is that demand before that supply is implemented. And again, that links in for, we need to know and we need to highlight that these victims are very much there, but hidden. And again, we're living in a data-led world, meaning there is less being done to address the issue. So the report makes a lot of recommendations, and I will ensure that if you'd like to find the report, if you just Google, if you put it into a search engine and you type in domestic abuse in rural communities or the Rural Crime Network, you will get access to the document, which is Captive and Controlled. It's the title of the document, and all the research is within that. It makes a series of recommendations to the government, the police and society. Now, I'm not going to go over as much the government and police ones, because I really want us to home in on the ones that are relevant to us and the way in which those working within rural communities, and also those who are sitting within other statutory organisations, local authority and partners far and wide, you know, how important it is that we are connecting with those local communities and what they're doing in order to make them connections. So we're going to focus on the society recommendations. So some of the recommendations made for practice. Number one is that those living in rural communities may form a significant minority, but these cannot be ignored. They may not be highlighted on a graph of the UK, and we see them in those lighter areas, but we know that domestic abuse is there. We can't ignore it, and whilst we're not looking for it, we're probably not going to see it either. Another recommendation is there is a gaping hole in the understanding around victims of abuse in rural settings, and an ultimate kind of recommendation is that this is exactly the same for and extends beyond domestic abuse to cover all exploitation, child exploitation, human slavery and other forms of abuse, because this is occurring much far and wider, much rural, much more isolated communities. We're not seeing those figures. We're not identifying necessarily where this is happening, where this is taking place, because it's much more hidden because of all of the reasons that we've looked at so far as part of the session. And it makes it even more key on us that we are, when we're in these communities, when we're working with the communities, when we're thinking about how we can reach these communities, just how important it is that that collaborative working takes place. Again, a third point was that together we must challenge and address the underlying societal structures and stigmas underpinning and facilitating domestic abuse. You know, domestic abuse on the whole is heavily, heavily underpinned by long-term existing, very traditional, very stereotypical views on men and women in society and how women should be seen and roles of men and women and those real gendered stereotypes. And as individuals, it is us that's going to be responsible for that change and to question and challenge safely and appropriately where we're seeing these things and we're identifying that there is maybe a gendered bias or that somebody has been treated a slightly different way because of their sex or their role. And it's equally just as important, as I said, safely and appropriately, that we do challenge them because it's the only way we're going to undo some of those really kind of derogatory and discriminatory attitudes that do still exist. And fundamentally, the research highlights a traditional society where women, and mostly women, are dominated, abused and controlled, not just by abusers, but by their circumstances and communities. This links heavily with the point made above, in which these communities and the way that they are built and run and the power dynamics and the key roles and things like this, how, you know, women are. And even though this report is, again, looks at domestic abuse on a wider level, you know, it very much recognises that in these communities, it's even more apparent that women are, is that the clear power divide between men and women in these communities and families. So what can we do? I've got a couple of slides now that I'd like to share with you in terms of what we can do as staff, paid or unpaid, whatever your sector that you work in, how we can use what information we can gather from this research and how we can use it to change and adapt and try and access and support victims, particularly those living in rural communities, in a more better and informed way, more effective way. So again, I've put there, but always be conscious to the additional barriers which are faced by victims of domestic abuse living within rural communities. If you've got somebody who seems difficult to engage, who is not very responsive, who's maybe not answering telephone calls, not being in when you visit, quite reluctant for you to visit them at home, it's about looking and questioning what additional barriers are preventing them from engaging in this support with me. What fears are there? What worries are there? Who else might be alerted to the fact if they do have this appointment or this meeting? Because where we can discuss with victims the barriers that they're facing, we can try and find ways of working around them and offering solutions and maybe trying to work a little bit out of the box with somebody, but in which we can try and meet their needs and work with them in a safe way. Again, always be aware of the ways in which perpetrators of domestic abuse may use isolation and barriers to accessing support to further controlling victims. Just the fact that you may leave this session with an enhanced understanding of how much that isolation is being used as a purposeful tactic of abuse allows you to think, right, I recognize that. So what can I do different? How can I reach that victim now? How can I make it easier? Is there an appointment they do go to that's local? Is there a community venue that maybe they visit once a week? Is it a food bank? Is it a local shop? Is it a coffee morning drop-in? Is it a parent and toddler group? Is there something that they do access or are allowed to access because it's within the community that I can use as a means of trying to work a little bit more creatively to reach and communicate with that victim? Never make assumptions such as it would never happen to here. As mentioned earlier, I think we can have these rose-tinted glasses sometimes, and we look at these communities which on the surface are close-knit and very friendly, supportive. We all have these idealistic kind of views. But as we know, you know, sometimes some of the most riskiest forms of behaviours and harm are actually the ones that are most hidden. You know, perpetrators purposely know how to put on a show and a display to the outside the world. They look like the most loveliest, kindest, friendliest people you could ever meet. And this is all part of the act. This is all part of how the abuse is hidden. This is all part of how people don't identify it, don't question it. So never think it wouldn't happen here. Things on the surface can look smooth and idealistic, but at the end of the day, underneath it all, there could be a victim living in absolute hell. So it is always, never just take it at face value. Always think about that professional judgment and your gut instinct. If something's telling you something is wrong, the chances are there probably is something, and it's trying to work out what that is. Again, identify and professionally challenge instances where traditional, patriarchal, or stereotypical attitudes are being used to oppress and control others, particularly when there is a concern that there is domestic abuse. So we can sometimes go along with, when we are engaging with new communities, when we are, we can find that we unwillingly kind of go along with views and attitudes because we see it as being their culture or their community, or that's just how it's done there. But actually, if something about you is telling you something's uncomfortable, something's not right, somebody is being oppressed here or discriminated against, or where that issues of power and that power imbalance is really apparent and having an impact on somebody, it's about being able to appropriately and safely challenge them. But also, you may be the first person for that victim who actually recognizes that what the situation that they're in is oppressive and is, could be being used as a form of control. So again, being aware of the risks and indicators of abuse. I will mention later, in a couple of slides later, about some domestic abuse training that we do offer at ERVAS. As part of my role, we deliver a formal training programme to all VCSE organisations, but it is exactly the same training that is delivered within the local council at East Riding of Yorkshire Council, so any sector can access that training. Domestic abuse can be very subtle, can be very difficult to identify because it's relationships, and we all have very different views on what is right and what is wrong in a relationship. Some things are really obvious, but other things in between can be interpreted very differently person to person. So if you haven't already, there is some different options for domestic abuse training, but I highly recommend that you engage with some form of training program that really enhances your understanding of what domestic abuse is and how it impacts on victims. If you ever do become concerned, you get that gut feeling, your professional judgment tells you something is not right, please always ask. And what we always say is you could be the only person that does. There can be so many people who, after things like a serious case review or in relation to a domestic homicide review, who say, do you know what, I knew that something wasn't right, I recognise this, I remember seeing this, but actually you may find that not one of them person ever comes forward and says to that person, is everything okay, are you all right, is that, are you experiencing domestic abuse? And there's many reasons for that. There's many reasons that prevent somebody coming forward, through fear of upsetting the person, for fear of getting it wrong, for fear of affecting the relationship that's maybe been built with that person. But what I will always say and stand by is, even if you get it wrong, they're going to be absolutely fine. The worst thing they're going to say to you is, no, I'm not an impact, I'm not affected. And it may be that at that moment in time, they may be experiencing domestic abuse, but not at a point that they are willing or ready to share that or discuss that with somebody. But by simply asking that question, you've opened that channel of communication that somebody's recognized something's not right, and they just might not be at that point in time that they are ready to share that with someone. But when they are, you'll probably be one of the first people that they will think to reach out to, because they know that you've recognized something. They know that something's not quite right. So another key one is knowing your local domestic abuse service. There is so many people who, worked as part of the domestic abuse service, as part of the East Riding Council, and when I've come into contact with them, they have sworn that they never even knew there was a domestic abuse service. So simply knowing that, and you know, part of that, as you know, if you are a community, particularly in a rural community, is being able to advertise that there is. So we say there, actively display posters, advertisements, things that may ask the question, that get it out there that these services exist and they are there to support victims. And as it says there, you may be the only organisation that does have contact with that victim. On that note, I am more than happy if you are a setting, whether you are in a rural community or not, it does not matter. If you are happy to actively display posters and advertisements about domestic abuse services, please get in touch with me via the email address that I'll give you in a moment, because we can send them out to you at no cost. You don't need to print anything. We can make sure that the domestic abuse service sends you them posters and advertisements for you to put up absolutely free of charge. And just having them posters could be a lifesaver for someone, so please do that. Also, when supporting someone to seek help, share information on a need-to-know basis only. And it says there, you never know, might be collusive with the perpetrator. So if you are living in a community or you're part of a community group and you have these suspicions, sometimes the worst thing you can do is go to someone else and say, I'm worried about so-and-so because I've seen this or I've heard this, or because you never quite know who that person might be connected to, and if that information might get back to an alleged perpetrator. If it does, you know, it's almost always going to result in higher risks for that victim, because the more perpetrators of abuse think they are losing the control, the tighter they will tighten their grip on that person to gain that control back. So always either try and speak directly with that person or somebody that you absolutely know is a safe person for that victim. Ensure that your staff within your organisation have completed a basic level of domestic abuse training. That links very much into point 1 and leads us really nicely into my next slide after this one, which we will look at the domestic abuse training a little bit more. So domestic abuse services. So for those who've not had any contact with your local domestic abuse service, this is the domestic abuse services for the East Riding of Yorkshire Council. If you live outside of this area, you can literally just Google your area and domestic abuse services. Or if you are really struggling, again, reach out to me and I will help and direct you. But there will be some form of domestic abuse service in every area that will be able to provide support to victims of abuse. So within the East Riding, ours is the Domestic Violence and Abuse Partnership, also known as DVAP for short. And they are made up of a number of teams. The first one is the adults team. You've got an operational team there for all queries, and you've also got a confidential helpline. So for the operational team, if you are maybe working in a professional capacity with somebody, or you're supporting them in a community setting and you would like a bit of advice for that person, you can ring that one and speak to somebody. Or alternatively, if you have a victim come to you for support, it may be that you assist them to provide them with a safe space so that they can use the confidential helpline to seek support in their own right. You have got a children's service there, and they provide support to children, generally be aged between 5 and around 15, 16, or up to that point where they may be considered an adult. And they tend to provide support to children that have maybe become witness or kind of a bit caught in the crossfire in a domestic abuse relationship. And then you've also got the Prevention of Domestic Abuse Service, which is a service designed to support those who wish to address their aggressive or abusive behaviours. So if they are recognise that some of their behaviour is abusive to others within an intimate partner relationship, or a familial one, so if it still comes under the definition of domestic abuse, and they can ring that and they can make a referral to get support in their own right. One of the last slides is our domestic abuse practitioner standards. So this is a training that has been adopted by East Riding of Yorkshire Council, and it has come it's a national-wide training delivery program. It comes in 3 different levels: level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1 is designed for anybody having access to people within their community or in their job role. You know, anybody who has a public facing role, it does not matter what that is. If you're coming into contact with people in your community, I would highly recommend that you complete at least level 1. And level 1 is all about identifying and recognizing abuse and knowing where it is that you seek support for that abuse. For those who have a little bit more in-depth kind of contact and engagement with those impacted or possibly impacted by abuse, we do recommend going on to level 2, because that level looks at both its ask and act. So it's what questions you need to ask if somebody is about to disclose or you're concerned that there is abuse, and also what actions you need to take to keep that victim safe. We will also, as of next year, 2024, be offering a level 3, which is a level 3 training, which is for those specifically working with children, families, adults affected by domestic abuse, and they're supporting them with that, but they're maybe not IDFA trained, so Independent Domestic Violence Advocate trained. All the training is CPD accredited and certified. And if you are within a VCSE organisation, so your community, your charity, you can access the training via myself. I've put my email address there, gemma@airvas.org.uk, and we are able to come out and provide that training in-house in organisations, and that's completely free of charge for us to come and deliver that. What we usually do is ask that people pop us an email, telephone call, get in touch. We'll ring and speak to you. We'll find out a little bit more about your organisation, and then we will arrange to come in, usually in person or online. Do prefer online for this level of training and because of the topic of training. And we'll come and go through that with you and complete that training. If you are part of another sector organisation and you are working, living in the East Riding, you can access the same training, albeit more often it's delivered online, as part of the East Riding Safeguarding Children Partnership training offer. So if you go on to the link, or even just Google East Riding, Google search any of those, East Riding Safeguarding Children Partnership training, you will see there the different options for accessing the domestic abuse training there. And then also for those who prefer an online, because you're even not able to access any of the above, you can access via the IDAS, which is the Independent Domestic Abuse Service as part of North Yorkshire. You can access their online training course. Again, that's absolutely free of charge, and it's an introduction, a domestic abuse basic awareness training. You can access that via their website also. So there is lots of options there, and I do highly recommend, where possible, that people do complete one of those, just to have that little bit more understanding of what domestic abuse is. This is where I would normally ask if any questions. What I would say is that if anybody does have any further questions, queries, or anything that you would like any support with, you do just get in touch with me at Gemma at, well, I'll pop it on the screen for you, gemma@airvas.org.uk. And then that's finally the last slide from me, and a huge thank you for listening and watching this webinar. I do hope that you've enjoyed it, and if there is any further support that we can offer, please get in touch with us or the Airvas team. Thank you very much.